She was supposed to say, "I do," to a man twice her age in exchange for her father's land. Instead, she vanished into the prairie night, right into the sights of a man with a price on his head. The dress didn't fit right, too tight at the ribs, too loose at the shoulders, stitched by hands that didn't care if she could breathe. Charlotte sat still while her stepmother yanked at the laces, muttering about posture, about decency, about making a good wife. The fabric scratched against her skin, white and stiff, with a row of pearl buttons that shimmered in the lamplight like tiny lies. Outside the canvas tent, fiddle music swirled with laughter, boots thudded against dirt, and someone uncorked a bottle with a cheer. It was supposed to be a celebration. It felt like a funeral. Her hair was being twisted into something it didn't want to be, pins stabbing into her scalp like needles, and when she winced, her stepmother smacked her on the shoulder with a sharp sigh. "You think this is hard?" the woman hissed. "Try being grateful for once. He's a landowner. He's respected. He's giving your father a second chance." Charlotte didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. She had said it all the night she learned what this wedding really meant, when her father came home drunk and muttering about banknotes and lost acres, about how Jedediah Pike was offering mercy, in the shape of a wedding band. Charlotte had cried then, quietly, in the dark, with her face buried in the thin pillow her mother once embroidered. But that was 2 nights ago, and now her tears were gone. Shame had dried them up. She stared at her reflection in the cracked tin mirror, skin too pale, lips too thin, freckles across her nose that no powder could hide. Her stepmother had told her once that no man would ever look at her and think beauty. But beauty wasn't being asked for. Obedience was. The preacher was already there, smoking by the fire, his Bible in one hand, a tin cup in the other. Jedediah Pike sat beside him, laughing, slapping backs, his belly pushing against his vest, silver hair slicked with oil, 30 years older and twice as loud. He hadn't looked at her like a bride. He hadn't looked at her at all. She was a transaction, plain and simple. As the music picked up and someone called for the bride, Charlotte's hands tightened in her lap. Her stepmother pressed a veil into her fingers. "Now don't be foolish," she said, tone sugar-laced but sharp. "Your father's reputation is at stake. Walk out, say the vows, and this'll all be over soon enough." Charlotte stood, slow and quiet, veil in hand, eyes unfocused. Her heart was loud in her chest, but her face stayed calm. She turned, as if to walk out into the waiting crowd, then slipped behind the tent flap instead, soft as a whisper. No one saw her vanish. The veil dropped in the dirt behind her, like a shed skin. She ran barefoot, the hem of her dress catching on dry grass, her lungs burning with the air she hadn't dared take in days. Behind her, laughter and fiddles, promises and prayers. Ahead, only dusk and silence, and the weightless thrill of not knowing where her feet would take her next. Charlotte ran until her sides ached and her breath came in ragged pulls, the stiff wedding dress dragging like a net around her legs. The prairie swallowed the last of the firelight behind her, and the sounds of the wagon train faded into nothing but wind. Her bare feet struck dry ground, kicked up dust, tore against sharp rocks she couldn't see. She didn't stop. Not when the cool night air scraped her throat, not when the shadows thickened, not even when the weight of what she'd done tried to settle on her shoulders like a yoke. She kept running until she couldn't anymore, until the dark wrapped around her so fully it felt like falling. She staggered to a stop by a line of twisted trees, one hand pressed to her ribs, the other clutching a fistful of dirt as if it might anchor her. The dress, once white and stiff, now hung crooked and torn, soaked with sweat and streaked with earth. Her hair had come undone, a wild mess tangled down her back. She didn't know where she was, only that it was far enough. For now. Then the shape moved, just ahead, between the trees, a slow step forward, the soft crunch of boots on dry leaves. She froze, heart kicking hard, too tired to run, too alone to scream. The moon slid free of the clouds and silvered the figure. A man, tall and still, with a rifle slung across his back, a coat that had seen better days, and a bandana drawn up over his face. Only his eyes were visible, shadowed and steady. She thought of the posters nailed to tavern walls, the stories whispered in towns like hers. Bandits, raiders, worse. She should have been afraid. Maybe she was. But mostly, she just stood there, chest rising and falling, waiting for whatever came next. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for the rifle, didn't ask what she was doing, or why a girl in a wedding dress was standing alone in the wild. He just looked at her a moment, then said, "You shouldn't be out here alone." Something about the way he said it, not like a warning, not like a threat, just plain and quiet, hit her harder than all the shouts back at camp. No one had said anything to her with that much stillness in a long time. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. Her voice, when it came, was rough from running. "I didn't have anywhere else to be." The man nodded once, slow, like he understood more than he let on. Then he turned and started walking. Not away, but along the tree line. Not fast, just enough to show her she could follow if she wanted to. She hesitated. But when he paused and glanced back, she stepped forward, something heavy lifting off her chest with every step that took her farther from the life she'd left behind. They didn't speak again, not yet. But Charlotte followed the stranger into the shadows, the night swallowing them both, and for the first time in months, she wasn't being dragged somewhere. She was choosing. And that made all the difference. They walked in silence through the night, their footsteps soft over dry grass and dirt, the only sound the low hush of wind weaving through cottonwood branches. Charlotte didn't ask where they were going. She didn't care. Every step farther from the wagon train felt like peeling off another layer of someone else's expectations. The stranger didn't press her with questions, didn't ask her name, didn't comment on the tattered wedding dress or the bruises blooming on her ankles from the long run. He simply walked ahead, steady and quiet, glancing back just enough to make sure she was still there. By the time the stars began to fade and the sky took on a thin blush of light, Charlotte's legs were shaking. She stumbled once, then again, and the man finally stopped, his hand lifting slightly, not to help, not to command, just to pause. "We'll rest here," he said, voice low and rough like gravel soaked in whiskey. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They were at the edge of a small creek, water trickling over rocks, cool and silver in the morning light. A fallen log made a place to sit, and she sank down onto it, pulling what was left of the wedding dress around her legs like it might still shield her from something. The man moved a few feet away, unslinging the rifle from his back and setting it gently against a tree. Then, without a word, he reached up and tugged the bandana from his face. It wasn't dramatic. There was no drum roll, no flash of lightning, just the quiet moment of truth under a pale orange sky. Charlotte looked at him, really looked, and her heart stopped for just a second. She knew that face, not from any meeting, but from the cracked wood wall of the general store back in Kansas, from the yellowed flyer with bold black ink and words like "armed and dangerous" stamped beneath the picture. Jesse Calder, wanted for robbery, assault, possible murder, reward posted, dead or alive. She didn't scream. Maybe she should have. Maybe her stepmother would have. But Charlotte just stared, too tired and too hollow to summon fear. Her fingers clenched around the edge of her skirt. Jesse didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his gun or offer excuses. He just sat down across from her, leaned his elbows on his knees, and looked off toward the rising sun like he didn't much care whether she ran or stayed. "You know who I am," he said after a long while. Not a question. "I saw your face on a poster," she answered softly. He nodded once, like that settled it. "You still walkin' with me?" Charlotte studied him. The lines on his face, the tired eyes, the scar near his jaw that looked more like a story than a warning. She thought of Jedediah Pike's breath stinking of whiskey and smoke, of her father's silence, of the preacher waiting to marry her off like a mule in trade. She thought of every man who'd looked at her like property. And then she looked at Jesse Calder. Outlaw, bank robber, maybe worse. And she stayed, sitting right where she was. "Yes," she said. He didn't smile, just reached into his coat, pulled out a piece of jerky, tore it in half, and handed her a piece without looking up. She took it with shaking fingers. They chewed in silence as the sun climbed higher. Two wanted people, one by law, one by blood, finding a kind of peace in the quiet neither had known in a long time. The fire was small, tucked between a ring of rocks, just enough to warm hands and chase back the cold creeping in from the prairie night. Jesse worked with quiet ease, gathering dry twigs, striking a match, coaxing the flames like an old friend. Charlotte sat nearby, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the orange light dance across the clearing. Her dress clung to her in damp folds, streaked with mud and torn at the hem, the veil long gone, hair tangled and heavy down her back. She felt like a ghost of the girl who'd slipped away from the wagon train, lighter somehow, though the weight of everything still pressed deep in her bones. Jesse didn't talk much, didn't ask about her family, or the man she'd almost married. He just opened his pack, pulled out a biscuit wrapped in cloth, and broke it in two, handing her the larger piece without looking at her. She took it, murmured thanks, and chewed slow. It was dry and tough, but it tasted like mercy. The wind stirred the trees around them, and somewhere in the distance a coyote cried out. Jesse didn't flinch. He was whittling a piece of wood now, something smooth and shapeless. The rhythm of the knife helped fill the silence. "You running from the law?" he asked finally, voice low but edged with something like amusement. Charlotte looked up, a corner of her mouth twitching. "You too," she said, and he let out a breath that might have been a laugh. They didn't need to explain. Her wedding dress told enough. His rifle said the rest. They were two people who didn't belong where they'd been, who had chosen the open road not because it was safe, but because it was the only place that didn't come with a chain attached. Jesse pulled a blanket from his pack, worn and patched but thick, and handed it to her without a word. She hesitated before taking it, something sharp rising in her throat. Not from fear, not from shame, but from how unfamiliar it felt to be offered something without a price. She wrapped it around her shoulders, its warmth soaking into her slowly, like a kindness she didn't know how to accept. "I was supposed to get married," she said after a while, the words catching as they left her mouth. "Didn't want to." Jesse nodded. "Suppose he did." "He didn't care either way," she muttered, staring into the fire. "Just wanted what I came with." He was quiet for a moment. Money? Land? A name? Something to make him look decent. Jesse tossed another twig into the flames. "Sounds like the kind of man who never looked you in the eyes." She blinked at that. Because it was true. And because this stranger, this outlaw, had more than once already, and never with hunger or pity, just quiet recognition, like he saw her without needing to own her. They sat in silence again, the fire crackling soft between them. Not quite friends, not yet free, but something passed between them in that small clearing, something wordless and strong. A spark, maybe. Not of love, not yet, but of understanding. The kind that could survive long miles and hard truths. When she finally lay down, curled in the blanket by the dying fire, she didn't feel safe exactly, but she didn't feel alone. And that, for Charlotte, was something close to a beginning. The sun rose slow and steady, painting gold across the dry ridges and distant hills as they packed up camp. Jesse moved with the quiet certainty of a man who didn't need to rush. Charlotte followed, the borrowed blanket folded tight in her arms, the wedding dress cut shorter with his knife the night before. She still felt the stiff lace at her waist and the scratch of seams meant for a ceremony that never happened. But with each mile, the fabric grew looser, more like clothes and less like chains. He didn't head back toward the wagon trail, didn't steer toward smoke or church bells or any place a preacher might wait. Instead, they veered west, into the parts of the land that maps forgot. Wide stretches of yellow earth and gnarled trees, hills that folded in on themselves, valleys hushed and green in their centers, as if guarding something sacred. Jesse didn't talk much, but when he did, it was useful. He showed her how to walk without snapping twigs, how to brush away tracks with a broken pine branch, how to tell if a creek had been crossed recently by looking for disturbed pebbles and bent grass. At first, she just watched. Then she started trying. By the third day, she was moving quieter, stepping where he stepped, scanning the horizon like she might catch whatever he always seemed to see before it appeared. She didn't speak of the wedding again. He didn't ask. But somewhere after they'd crossed a shallow stream and rested in the shade of a leaning rock, he passed her a tin cup and said, "You got a name, don't you?" She looked at him for a long second, unsure if it mattered anymore. Then she said it anyway. "Charlotte." He sipped from his cup, then gave a slow nod. "Nice name. Not the kind you throw away easy." She almost asked what he meant, but stopped herself. The way he said it, like it came from someplace inside him that still bled a little, made her quiet. She stared out at the red ridges beyond, the dust rising in soft curls beneath the wind. Maybe there were names he'd once cared for too, ones he'd lost or left behind. They kept moving, stopping only when night pressed in, or their shadows grew long across the stones. Charlotte's muscles ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that made her feel real again. Not like property, not like something traded, but like someone carving her own trail into the wild. One night, while they cooked a rabbit Jesse had trapped, she found herself humming without thinking. A tune her mother used to sing when brushing her hair, long before sickness stole the color from her cheeks. Jesse looked up from the fire but said nothing, just listened. And when she caught him watching her, she didn't look away. She didn't feel like the girl from the tent anymore. Charlotte didn't know where they were going, but for once, she wasn't afraid of the not knowing. Jesse moved like a man who didn't owe the world explanations, and in his quiet way, he was teaching her how to do the same. Not just how to survive out here, but how to belong, not to anyone but to herself. The river came into view just as the sun tilted low, casting a silver shimmer across the water and lighting the tops of the cottonwoods like fire. Charlotte felt a moment of calm at the sight, the soft rush of water, the way the trees leaned close together like a secret being told. But then, the stillness broke. Hoofbeats, fast and pounding, like thunder cracking open the earth. Jesse's head turned sharply. His hand went to the rifle slung over his shoulder, and without a word, he reached back, caught Charlotte's wrist, and pulled her into the tall reeds near the bank. She crouched low, heart thudding, breath caught halfway in her throat. Behind them, riders broke through the trees. 4, maybe 5, their shouts sharp, angry, familiar. Charlotte's stomach dropped when she caught a glimpse of one man's hat, Jedediah Pike's thick frame hunched over a dark horse, shotgun gripped in his fists. Her stepmother must have pointed the way, must have wanted her dragged back in time for a second ceremony. Jesse didn't wait. He moved to the edge of the reeds, dropped to one knee, and fired. The first shot cracked loud, sending one rider tumbling off his horse. The others scattered, firing back. Charlotte pressed her hands over her ears, ducked low, the silk dress snagging on every branch, every thorn, 1,000 white lies clinging to her legs. Jesse fired again, then grunted and fell sideways. She crawled to him, dirt scraping her knees, her fingers shaking as she reached his side. Blood, dark and spreading across his shirt, just below the ribs. He grimaced, but didn't cry out. His jaw locked tight as he tried to sit up. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Stay down. I'll get you out." The air smelled like gunpowder and mud. The river roared louder than before. She shoved her shoulder beneath his, lifting, dragging, stumbling as she half-carried him toward the water. Bullets sliced through branches above. One nicked the tree beside her. She didn't stop. Couldn't. She was cursing the dress now, out loud, teeth gritted, as the damn silk snagged and tore and wrapped around her legs like it wanted her to fail. They reached the riverbank, her legs giving out beneath her as she collapsed into the reeds beside him. His face was pale now, eyes narrowed against the pain. She pressed her hands to the wound, trying to remember what little she knew about stopping blood. The fabric soaked through quick, sticky and hot against her palm. "Hold on," she said, breathless. "Don't you dare pass out. It's Severy Ponnet." Jesse gave a weak smirk. "You're bossy for a runaway bride." She laughed then, sharp and broken, and it almost sounded like crying. The riders hadn't followed down into the reeds. Not yet. Maybe they thought he was dead already. Maybe they thought the river would do their work for them. But Charlotte stayed low, holding him tight, whispering his name like a prayer, like it was the only thing tethering him to this earth. And somewhere in that chaos, in the blood and smoke and the dress clinging like second skin, she stopped being afraid. She didn't feel like a girl running anymore. She felt like someone fighting for something she wasn't ready to lose. The cabin sat crooked against the hillside, half swallowed by overgrowth, roof sagging under the weight of years. Ivy clung to the chimney like a hand refusing to let go. No smoke had risen from it in a long time, and the door hung off one hinge like it didn't expect to be opened again. But Charlotte pushed it open anyway. Her shoulder braced against the warped wood, dragging Jesse inside with the last of her strength. The room smelled of dust, and pine, and something older, like dried tobacco and forgotten days. A single cot leaned in the far corner, mattress split open, straw spilling out like a wound. She eased Jesse down onto it, his breath shallow, his shirt dark with blood that hadn't stopped yet. His eyes fluttered open, but he didn't see her. She whispered his name again and again, just to hear it in the air, to remind herself he was still with her. There was a kettle left behind on a shelf, rusted but usable, a half-broken stool, a jar with the remnants of herbs that crumbled between her fingers. She found a knife, notched and dull, and boiled it in creek water alongside a strip of cloth she tore from the inside of her skirt. Her hands shook the whole time, but she didn't let herself stop. When she stitched the wound, Jesse barely made a sound. His face turned away, jaw tight, sweat running down his neck. Charlotte kept her lips pressed together, not trusting herself to speak. She wasn't a healer. She wasn't even sure she was doing it right, but he needed her, and that was more than anyone had needed her in a long time. By nightfall, the fever had come. His skin burned under her hand, his breath rough and uneven. She fed him water in slow sips, lifting his head when it lulled to the side, whispering soft nonsense just to fill the quiet. He didn't answer, didn't open his eyes, but sometimes he muttered things under his breath, fragments of dreams or memories that tumbled from his mouth like secrets never meant to be heard. He said a name once, Annie, soft, like a prayer. Charlotte froze, spoon in her hand halfway to his lips. He said it again, this time with more pain in it. Then a sentence that broke something inside her. I should have gone back for her. Charlotte sat back on her heels, hands in her lap, staring at the man who had dragged her through canyons and brush, who had taught her to move quiet and steady, who had taken a bullet meant for her. She'd thought of him as a wanted man, a runaway, someone carrying danger in his shadow. But now she saw the truth hiding in plain sight. He wasn't just running from the law. He was running from something deeper, the kind of grief that hollows a man out from the inside, the kind that doesn't show on a wanted poster. She wiped his forehead gently, then leaned close and whispered, "You don't have to keep running." He didn't answer, just turned his face toward her touch and let out a breath like he'd been holding it for years. And in that quiet, broken cabin, Charlotte realized they were both fugitives, but not from the same things. She had run to be free. He had run to forget. And now, together in the middle of nowhere, they were slowly learning what it meant to stop. The fever broke in the early hours, sometime between the hush of night and the pale light of dawn. Charlotte had been dozing in the corner, head against the cabin wall, when she heard Jesse stir. His breathing changed, steadier now, no longer caught in that half-dreaming gasp. She crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside the cot, and saw his eyes open, clouded but clear enough to find her face. "You're still here," he rasped, voice like gravel dragged over wood. "I never left," she whispered, brushing damp hair from his forehead. He looked around slowly, taking in the cabin, the fire she'd kept alive, the cup of water in her hands. He drank without question, his fingers brushing hers, then let out a soft sigh as he leaned back again. For a long time, they said nothing. The kind of silence that stretches without feeling heavy. Outside, birds were starting to call, and wind moved through the trees like a river. Then Jesse spoke, eyes fixed on the low beams above them. It was a small town, not much more than a church and a few stores. We lived in a house with a red door. My ma sewed quilts. My pa worked the freight line. Annie was 8, always running barefoot, always getting into things. Used to sneak sugar cubes from the jar when she thought no one was looking. Charlotte listened, still and quiet. Something in his voice had changed, softer, slower, like he was unfolding a part of himself he usually kept locked up tight. "I was away when it happened, out on a job, trying to earn enough to buy Ma a new stove. Raiders hit the town in the night, burned it to the ground, took what they wanted, shot who they didn't." His throat worked, and he looked away. "They said the fire got her, that they found her near the barn, curled up with her doll. I don't know if she was scared or just tired, but she didn't make it. None of 'em did." Charlotte's hand, resting near his, moved just slightly, but she didn't touch him yet. "I went to the law," Jesse said. "Told 'em who did it. Gave names, witnesses. Sheriff said it was too late, that the men were long gone, that there wasn't proof. Said justice don't always reach that far out." His voice grew flat, empty in the way grief sometimes sounds when it's turned cold from being held too long. "So I became someone they couldn't ignore. I found the ones who did it, one by one. It took years, took parts of me I don't think I'll ever get back, but I did it." He turned his head then, eyes meeting hers, raw and open in a way that startled her more than any wound ever could. "They say I kill for fun. That ain't true," he said quietly. "But I don't run from trouble no more." Charlotte didn't speak. She just reached over and placed her hand on his, warm and steady. His fingers twitched beneath hers, then settled, rough skin against soft. Two people who'd both lost too much to ever believe in fairy tales. But in that quiet moment, in a cabin no one talked about, something passed between them that didn't need words. She didn't tell him it would be okay, didn't offer forgiveness or comfort wrapped in a bow. She just stayed. And for Jesse Calder, that was more than anyone had done in a long time. The days stretched out like the land around them, wide and open, with a quiet that wrapped itself around Charlotte in ways she hadn't known she needed. The cabin, crooked and leaning, became more than shelter. It became something close to home, not because it was safe or solid, but because it was hers now, shared only with a man who never asked more than she could give. Jesse healed slowly. Each day he stood a little straighter, moved with less stiffness, though the scar left behind was a mean one. He didn't complain. He never did. When the pain flared, he'd grit his teeth and keep working, sharpening knives, mending old gear, fixing what could be fixed. And Charlotte, watching him, began to understand that strength wasn't in how hard a man hit, but in how quietly he kept going. She cut the dress one morning with his knife, sawing through silk and lace until the hem fell rough around her knees. The sleeves went next, and then she slipped into his spare shirt, the collar hanging wide at her neck, the fabric soft with wear. She looked at herself in the reflection off the wash basin. Bare legs, wild hair, bruises fading slow, and didn't flinch. She learned how to shoot, how to stand with her feet right, how to breathe out before pulling the trigger. Jesse taught her without raising his voice, correcting her with the touch of a hand on her elbow or a quiet word at her side. Her aim got better with every passing day, and when she finally hit a tin can clean off the fence post, he just nodded, like he'd expected it all along. They trapped rabbits, skinned them together at the edge of the firelight. Jesse showed her how to cook the meat so it didn't dry out, how to season it with wild herbs they found near the creek. She never would have guessed she'd learn to enjoy the taste, but she did. She started to enjoy a lot of things. The sound of his voice when it softened. The way his eyes scanned the horizon before they stepped outside. The way he waited for her to speak, never pulling at her silence. And then came the morning that changed her. The sun hadn't risen all the way yet, just a pale gold spilling over the tops of the trees. She stepped out of the cabin barefoot, arms crossed over Jesse's shirt, the breeze cool against her skin. He was already outside, tending to the traps, and when he turned and saw her, something in his expression shifted. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything. But his eyes lingered, not in hunger, not in pity, but in a quiet kind of wonder. Like he saw her not as a girl running or a bride left behind, not as something borrowed or broken or half-promised to another, but as someone who belonged exactly where she stood. And in that moment, Charlotte felt something bloom deep inside her chest. Slow and fragile, but real. For the first time in her life, she believed she could be unclaimed and still be worth loving. Not because someone said so, not because a vow demanded it, but because she had built something here in the wild, with her hands, her scars, and her own damn name. The ride into town was slow, deliberate. Jesse never liked crowds, never liked fences or walls or too many eyes in one place. They needed supplies, coffee, flour, maybe some oil if the price wasn't steep, and Charlotte had offered to go in alone. Jesse didn't argue. He stayed with the horses near the tree line, eyes always watching, jaw tight beneath his stubble. She could tell he hated being this close to people again. The town wasn't much. One crooked saloon with a warped porch, a general store, and a livery that smelled like old hay and rust. Charlotte tied her borrowed horse beside the rail, smoothed her shirt, and stepped inside. Heads turned when she entered, but no one said much. A few men tipped their hats, a boy near the door whistled low, and an old woman with a basket of beans muttered something under her breath. Charlotte ignored it all. Inside the saloon, the light was dim and the air thick with smoke and whiskey. She moved toward the counter, kept her chin up and her voice steady as she ordered what they needed. The barkeep, a man with cloudy eyes and grease-stained sleeves, barely looked at her as he packed the items into a worn cloth sack. She paid with coins Jesse had given her, counted out exact, no more and no less. That's when she saw it. Tacked behind the bar, curled at the edges and nailed through both top corners, was a new poster. Jesse's face stared back at her, the same worn photo she remembered from Kansas, but now the paper looked fresher, the ink darker, the words bolder. Jesse Calder, wanted for robbery, assault, and obstruction of justice, $2,000, dead or alive. The last 3 words hung there like a blade. Her fingers clenched around the sack. She kept her face calm, didn't let the shake in her chest reach her eyes. She thanked the man, grabbed the goods, and stepped out into the sunlight like nothing had happened. She didn't run, just walked, slow and steady, boots hitting the dust in rhythm with her thoughts. Jesse was still where she left him, sitting under the tree with one hand resting on the saddle horn, like he was carved there. He looked up as she approached, eyes scanning her face like he always did, checking for something she never said out loud. "All good?" he asked. She nodded. Prices were fair. He didn't press, just took the sack, loaded it on the mule, and helped her back into the saddle. They didn't speak much on the ride back. The sky was clear, the wind low, the kind of day that pretends nothing's wrong. That night, after dinner, when the fire burned low and Jesse was sitting with his legs stretched out, cleaning the rifle with slow, even strokes, Charlotte sat beside him and leaned her head gently against his shoulder. She didn't mention the poster. Didn't say a word about the price on his life or the way the bartender hadn't blinked when ringing her up. She just slipped her hand into his and gave it a small squeeze. He looked down, then over at her, something soft flickering behind the tired lines of his face. He didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't offer. But in that silence, in that touch, she told him everything he needed to know. And he squeezed back. The first bullet shattered the window. Charlotte dropped the tin cup in her hand, heart slamming against her ribs as glass sprayed across the cabin floor. Jesse was already moving, pushing her down, grabbing the rifle. The second shot punched through the door, splinters raining across the room. Outside, hooves thundered, men shouting, guns cocking. No words of warning. No call to surrender. Just fire and fury. Jesse crouched by the table, eyes scanning the trees, breath coming quick. She saw the way his jaw clenched, the flicker of pain in his side. He was still healing. Not ready for this. Not again. He returned fire through the broken window, calm and measured. One shot, reload. Another. He didn't waste bullets. But there were too many of them. Charlotte counted at least 4 voices. Maybe 5. She could see their shadows moving along the tree line, circling the cabin like wolves. Stay down, he told her, blood already staining his shirt where the old wound had torn open. But she didn't listen. She reached for the pistol by the stove, the one he'd taught her to shoot with, her fingers shaking as she gripped the handle. Her dress was gone, the silk traded for rough cotton and boots that could run. She wasn't the girl who'd slipped out the back of a wedding tent anymore. Another shot hit the wall near Jesse's head. He ducked lower, swore under his breath. They're not gonna stop, he said, voice rough. They want the bounty. Charlotte moved to the back door, cracked it open, saw one rider flanking left, his rifle raised. Her hands trembled. She fired. The shot rang wild, missing wide. The man ducked, shouted something to the others. She breathed hard, swallowed the fear crawling up her throat, and fired again. This time, she hit him. He screamed, twisting in the saddle, falling into the dirt with a thud that echoed louder than the shot. The others hesitated. Jesse used the pause to drop another man with a shot clean through the chest. Blood hit the leaves. One of the horses reared, rider falling. The last 2 turned, spurred their mounts, and fled into the trees, their yells fading with the pounding of hooves. Silence followed. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that waits to see what's still breathing. Charlotte stepped outside, smoke still rising from the barrel of the pistol. Jesse staggered after her, hand pressed to his side, blood soaking through his shirt again. He took 2 steps, then dropped to one knee, then both. She caught him before he hit the ground, cradling him against her like something precious. He was heavy in her arms, breathing shallow, eyes half-lidded. She looked down at him, the man who had carried her across plains, who had given her fire and freedom and never once asked her to be less than herself. And she stood there, over his body and the blood-soaked earth, gun still clutched in her hand, not shaking anymore, not afraid, not running, just ready. The seasons turned soft that year, as if the earth itself had taken a breath. The snow never came heavy, just light dustings that melted by midday, and spring arrived, with more green than Charlotte remembered ever seeing. The trees around the cabin filled out, the creek ran full and clear, and the wildflowers came early, dotting the hills in yellow and purple like spilled paint. Jesse's wound healed slow, leaving a scar that pulled a little when he stretched, but he didn't complain. Not about that. Not about anything. The law stopped coming. No more riders. No more shouting in the trees. The posters faded in the towns, curled and sun-bleached, until they were just scraps of paper no one noticed. Jesse's name lost its sharp edge. His past, once heavy and loud, became something he didn't have to carry alone anymore. They stayed at the cabin, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Charlotte planted a garden beside the porch, her fingers deep in the soil, pulling weeds, laying seeds, humming soft, while the sun warmed her back. Jesse fixed the roof, repaired the door, built a little fence around the vegetable patch with old wood he pulled from the barn. He found a saddlebag one day, buried beneath a pile of broken tack, and inside it were 3 books, tattered, pages loose, but still readable. He read them one by one, slow and careful, like each word mattered. A clothesline stretched between 2 trees, white shirts and cotton slips dancing in the breeze. Charlotte boiled water in a dented pot, hung herbs to dry near the window, stitched tears in fabric with thread from a tin box. She didn't wear the wedding dress anymore. That had been burned months ago, piece by piece, in the fire out back. Jesse had watched it go without saying a word, just standing beside her, the flames catching the silk and lace like it had been waiting to be undone. They never married. There was no preacher, no vows, no ring slid onto a finger. But every morning, he filled her cup first, and every night she turned down the blanket for him without asking. He kissed her once, in the quiet between chores, hands still dirty from the garden. She kissed him back, and that was enough. Sometimes they didn't speak for hours. Jesse would sit on the porch, eyes on the ridge, and Charlotte would shell peas by the window. The silence wasn't heavy. It felt like peace, like something earned. They didn't talk much about before. About the man who'd waited at the altar, or the girl Jesse couldn't save. But sometimes, when the wind came up just right, Charlotte would place her hand over his and hold it there. And Jesse would close his eyes like it made something settle in him. They didn't carve their names into wood, didn't write letters to tell the world they'd made it. But in the small things, in the way they moved around each other, in the way they shared the sunrise and the last bit of coffee, there was a truth stronger than paper and louder than promises. They had run from cages, from walls built by others, from names that didn't fit. But out here, under the same stars that once watched them flee, they stayed, and they called that staying love. The West may be gone, but its stories still ride. Like and subscribe to keep the legend alive.